And I think I'm also due lunch.
Og du styrer alltid, så jeg tenker ikke på av og på.
Du går på scenen, så kommer du på.
Like that? That's in there. Okay. Thank you.
I think we can start this side event on the future Arctic Science funding. It's a 90-minute session approximately. But first of all, I would like to welcome Chief Executive of the Research Council of Norway, Mari Sundtveit, who will be with us and welcome you, Mari. So please, Mari.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you all for being here for this important side event about the funding of Arctic science. And I just guess and feel pretty sure that all of you in this room agree that that is of utmost importance that we have a strong plan for moving forward on funding Arctic science. Arctic science, of course, transcends national boundaries, and so does its funding. And I think that it might need to do that to a further extent than what we do at the moment. So it's great to have this international discussion regarding this. This Tuesday afternoon, many of us participated in a roundtable discussion about the planning and funding of the next International Polar Year, and that's an important part of it, and getting up to speed, ramping up towards 2032-33. It's a very good frame for our endeavors here. It was a very good and productive discussion, I think, about that international collaboration in Arctic research and how we can go about it together to make the most of it to the benefit of all. It's of course international by nature, and therefore it's so important that both scientists and funders collaborate closely across borders. Research results, as we were also discussing in this morning's plenary this morning, it's of the utmost importance that it's actually used by decision makers, whether it's in the public sector, it's politicians, whether it's in the business sector, but also throughout society. What we're talking about here is a fundamental societal change with all the dimensions. So making that new knowledge available to decision makers in a way that is useful to them, it's going to be fundamental to have the best possible sustainable development of the Arctic. And these are sticky, tricky areas, but we have very important roles to play in this. When we talk about the Arctic, sometimes we talk about it as if it's one thing. and it's not, of course. It's not by any means uniform, and the climate and the societies, the people, it's very different here in the Barents region compared to example to North America. So we're going to have panels looking into this with different angles about funding and towards the International Polar Year. And I'm very excited to hear from the early career scientists. I always find that the early career scientists bring novel knowledge, but also ways of thinking, ways of approaching it. To the table, and that is exactly what we need. And the next International Polar Year is a great opportunity to enhance collaboration in Arctic science, and let's make the most of this opportunity. Let's make sure that all of us in this room, all of us dealing with funding, take that responsibility, feel it a little bit heavily in our hearts, so that we really grab that imperative and run forward and make it happen. So I wish you the best of luck with the discussions in this important side event. Back to you, Christina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mari. And I have to introduce myself also. My name is Kristina Abildgaard, and I am a director heading the Department of Ocean and Polar Research in the Research Council of Norway. And I have then the great pleasure to be the moderator today. So as Mari pointed out, there are global challenges. We need international collaboration in order to address these global challenges. So the Arctic science community, they are more or less international in their character. But the science needs to be funded. And of course, the national funding agencies, they are vital in developing and implementing national Arctic strategies and priorities. And they also support international collaboration, for instance, through Horizon Europe, through Belmont Forum, through JPI joint programming initiatives, and through Nordic collaboration, and a lot of other international collaboration mechanisms. But are we doing well enough? And here in these Arctic Frontiers days, we have heard a lot about that maybe it wasn't that successful in international collaboration in the previous International Polar Year. Maybe we could have done it better. And also there are very challenging threats and tension when it comes to collaborations with other countries. We have Russia, China, and so on. So what we would like to do in this side event here is, of course, to have some reflection about the experience we have done. And we will have a presentation by Henry Burgess in just a few minutes. And in the first panel, we will have focusing on funding of Arctic science and a reflection about that. And then in the second panel, we have conducted that with members from the science community, both very experienced scientists, but also young career. You said that, Mari, it was always very important and interesting to listen to the reflection by the young scientists. And after their discussion, we will also invite you in the audience to address these issues. But then, first of all, Henry, we would very much like to hear your reflections on the 5th International Polar Year, the plans, opportunities, and learning from the past. And probably many of you know that you are the head of the National Environment Research Council, NERC, the Arctic office in the UK. And there you are very engaged in developing new funding and cooperation opportunities, which is very relevant for this session. And also, many of you know that you have been elected to the president of IASC, International Arctic Science Committee, in 2022. So you are the president at this time. So please, Henry, take the floor and give your presentation.
Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much, Christina, for that introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about International Polar Year. So I have these two hats. I have a UK hat and as president of the International Arctic Science Committee. So I will be talking with my president's hat on rather than my UK hat. Perhaps we might start with a bit of participatory democracy. So who has heard of the International Polar Year? Stick your hand up. More or less everyone. Good, good. You're in the right place. But equally, if you haven't heard about it, you're also in the right place. Who has seen a presentation on the International Polar Year? Okay, that's fewer hands. Okay. Well, if you have seen one, you're in luck because you're going to have another one. And if you haven't seen one, this is your opportunity to have a presentation. But almost everything I say today will be in the leaflet. And I've distributed some of those, and we have some more if you would like them. So please do look at the leaflet. We have a website detail on the back here, so please do go to that. Three things I would like you to remember from this talk, rather than, even if you don't remember anything else from what's presented or what's in the leaflet, three things. This is an International Polar Year, so it's the Arctic and the Antarctic. And because the Arctic community is so active and so vibrant, we talk about IPY a lot more in Arctic settings than we do in Antarctic settings. But this is absolutely equal in terms of it being a polar year. It's Arctic and Antarctic. And we've spent quite a long time, and we started this process very early, as you will see, making sure that the Antarctic science community and others were just as happy with the process and just as invested in it as the Arctic community. So this isn't polar meaning Arctic, this is polar meaning Arctic and Antarctic. Second thing to bear in mind is that this is an international polar year for genuinely everyone. It's an international polar year. It's not a UK polar year, it's not a European polar year, it's not a North American polar year, it's an international polar year. And we will really only make the IPY as successful as it should be if we go with that mindset. So everyone that's interested in the polar regions, or everyone who might be interested in the polar regions in the future. There are people here who haven't been involved in IASC or SCAR or other settings, but who will have a role to play in the International Polar Year. So that's something in my mind as well, which is hard in some ways, but I think important. And then the third thing is that we are just starting this process. So although we have a leaflet and a website and some slides, we are very, very much at the start of this process. So we are open to all good ideas, all opportunities. It's not too late by any manner of means. And the other thing to say is that this will not, I hope, be a top-down process, although we have to have some structure. So it will not be, I don't think, a single IPY program that's funded in one piece, where everything is coordinated, everything matches, everything has to have permission. It won't be like that. It'll be much more a framework, I suspect, of activity where people can thrive and do good things within an IPY framework. There will be some process to make sure that we only select the programs and the projects which support the IPY's values, but it will be, I hope, a relatively light touch process. But all that is to come. The other thing to say is that if you have good ideas, that's great, but we do not have a big secretariat at the moment, and we'll only have the secretariat of the size that we need. So if you have good ideas, that's great, but you should feel empowered to take some of those yourselves and run with them. So with those caveats, I will speed through some of these slides because I'm interested in the discussion, and I think that's where the meat of this session will really be. You will know that this is the 5th IPY. The previous IPYs have been usually every 50 years. This one is 25 years since the last one in 2007-8, and that's because the urgency of what we know about the change that's happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic, the environmental change, but the social and economic changes as well. But also the opportunities to learn more with remote sensing and AI and autonomous vehicles and new countries being involved. So we thought we didn't want to wait for 50 years after 2007. We wanted to do it earlier than that, and everyone agreed. We started this process early, and that is very, very much with thanks to our executive secretary in IASC, Gerlis Fugman, who sat at the back of the room, because she foresaw the need very early to make sure that we started this process as soon as we could, because the world is more complicated now, and we knew that in 21, even as we know it even more in 25. So she wanted to make sure that we collated the whole community together as early as possible to agree some key principles and to create some structure for the IPY, so that it began as we want it to continue as a genuinely international effort led by international organizations with the support and the involvement and the deep connection to national funders and other funders, but that we made this a genuinely international effort, and it didn't end up starting in one country for good or ill and having that character. We wanted it to be genuinely international, as the previous ones have been. So we have this concept note, and we have a website. It's fairly rudimentary at the moment, the website, but it is a start, and I'm very grateful to the University of the Arctic, who have made that possible. University of the Arctic are a great partner and supporter in this IPY, as they have been in the previous ones as well. The planning timeline. I've seen this slide on the screen in lots of presentations over the last 2 or 3 days, which is great, which is really, really good to see. All of this you are welcome to borrow and to use. The thing that I focus on here is that top sort of right-hand side slope and peak, and then legacy, that arrow in the top right. Because although we're focused on 2032 and 33, 2 years to give us an Antarctic season and an Arctic season, this is not just a pulse of activity in those 2 years, and that's it. It's very much a lead-up to those 2 years, and then a legacy beyond. So if people are starting work in 2007, 6, 8, that is work that can be part of the International Polar Year. That's absolutely fine. We'll work out the process for that to happen. So it's a pulse of activity in 32, 33, but not only activity in those years. You can also see that we are connecting through to some of the wider processes that we know are happening, the UN Decades for Sustainable Development, Indigenous Languages, and the UN Decade for Action on Cryospheric Sciences. So we're aware of all these. IPY will link with them where we need to, connect, have synergistic connections, but IPY is not part of these decades, and they are not part of us. So we are planning separately at the moment, but I suspect we'll get closer as we go towards 32, 33. But at the moment, IPY is a separate process and is led by the structures that we will talk about here. We've already got some idea of what some of the big programs might be, so we wanted to give a sense of what some of those might be, even at this early stage. So Arctic Pulse, which is being led out of Canada in connection with other international partners, and then the Antarctica in Sync idea. So all of those are the beginnings of things that we think might be potentially IPY contributing programs. And of course, there's the big Arctic Ocean 2050 program, which is being developed here in Norway, and I hope that will also too feature in this timeline pretty shortly. We're also focused on making sure that we don't end up at the start of the IPY process, sort of now, or soon, not knowing what our science priorities will be for the Arctic. So we have a separate process called the International Conference on Arctic Research Planning, which happens once every 10 years, which brings together the science priorities and determines which are the most important for Arctic science. This is Arctic side rather than Antarctic side, but that process will give us some of these science priorities that leads into the International Polar Year, so we're not starting from scratch. That process is happening now. There's a big meeting in Boulder in a couple of months' time, and then by this time next year, we will have those priorities ready to feed into the International Polar Year. A little bit about the structure, because it sort of is important. There is an executive committee, which is IASC, and also SCAR, Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, our sister organization in Antarctica, and then the International Science Council and the WMO, the UN agency. That's the executive committee. Those are the organizations that basically helped to run and manage the process last time round, and we thought that was the right approach to take this time too. But we have a much wider planning group, which is all the logos. Close. All the logos. Yeah, good. All the logos you can see here. And this group is not closed, so if organizations would like to be part of this group, then you are very welcome. There might be a gap at some point to fill, so you're very welcome. But at this stage, what we want is for that planning group, the members of that planning group to be international, to be regional, to be internationally representative. So we're not looking for individual universities or individual countries to be on that group. That's not the right stage. There'll be other opportunities for those organizations to participate. Yes, so how to get involved. I said a bit about being involved in the IPY planning group. There's not the end point, but the start. So we have groups on country and funders. We have groups on, I'm going to forget them all. We have groups on country and funders. We have a group on vision and priorities. We have one on capacity and education. And then we have one on indigenous involvement as well. So these groups are just starting, and there's very much an opportunity to get involved in those. And those will help set some of the detail of what needs to come next. Those groups aren't set, so we can have other groups in the future, and I'm sure that we will. So yes, this is the opportunity to join the planning group. So the QR code will take you to the right place, and that's all on the website. And these are our next steps. So events like this are very much part of the next steps, because we want to understand with the community what you would like to see as part of the IPY, but more importantly, what you have to contribute. And we've had some really good discussions here this week in these settings and in others with the people who will be responsible for delivering the IPY. We recognize that at some point there will be national committees. Most countries will want to set up a national committee or a point of contact or a reference point. That doesn't need to be the same in every country, but it's important that probably that those are beginning to be set up, and I know Norway has made great progress in that already. And at some point we will have a way of bringing those countries and those points of contact together. I think I will leave it there, other than to say this is how to contact the IPY Secretariat, which essentially is Gerlis, who sat at the back, so you can have a word with her as well. But when it comes to the Secretariat, we want to make sure that it is the right size to do the jobs that need to be done now. There may come a point at which we need it to be bigger. We haven't taken a decision yet on whether that needs to be in one place or in one organization or spread over different organizations or places, but we want to make sure that we're ready to do that. But whatever your interest and your capability, there will be an opportunity to contribute to the IPY. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. Very informative, and if you like to contribute, I think everybody would like to contribute in this. So then we will start with the first panel, where we will focus on funding of Arctic Science, and I would like to invite Volker Rachol here. He's head of the German Arctic office at Alfred Wegener Institute. And also the next one, David Hick. I would very much like to invite you. You are the Chief Scientist and Executive Director of Polar Knowledge in Canada. I think we should put the chairs a little bit here. So, but don't fall down. Maybe you sit it there. And then finally, Jon Fuglestad, please. You are a special advisor in the Research Council of Norway, and also you are the chair of the Arctic Science Funding Forum. So please take a seat and don't fall down. So I think I would start with you, Volker. You are also, you have an experience by being the Executive Secretary of IASC in 2006, and I think you spent the time there around 10 years. So you were very heavily involved in IPY for fourth, I guess. So it would be very interesting to hear your reflection on experiences and also on how do we move forward when it comes to IPV 5 and funding. So what's your comments?
So I think in general, of course, we had the same discussion in the last IPY, but I think in that IPY we started too late. So I think, and I'm really glad that IASC and SCAR decided to start this discussion, especially on the funding, much earlier. We had some successful things also in the last IPY in terms of funding, but we could have done, I think, much better actually. So, there were, I think the last IPY had possibly a bit different approach. It was more just a collection of any ideas compiled into a program by an IPY joint committee. But then what happened is that these identified IPY projects, of course they were international, and not all the countries were really set up to provide funding for IPY. So what happened is that some of these projects got some funding from some countries, but no funding from other countries. And then of course some of them just collapsed, because without the international funding they would not really work. So only a few of them, for others it worked. But I think the mistake we possibly did was just to start this discussion too late. And this is good that you started early. And then, of course, we have more things now that developed over the last 10 years that we didn't have for the last IPY. We had the process of the Arctic Science Ministerials, which was, I think, very important. So we had 3 ones. We had one in Washington, one in Berlin, and one in Iceland. And still, we are, of course, hopeful that we at some point will be able to have a 4th one, which was actually planned to be co-organized by Russia and France, and obviously could not take place. One thing that came out of this, and that's an also very interesting instrument that we have now, is the Arctic Science Funders Forum. So we had meetings here, and Yvonne from the Research Council is currently chairing it. I think a very important instrument for the funders really to sit together and talk, and to discuss ideas, to connect to each other, both on bilateral activities, but also multilateral. And that is the thing that came out of the 2nd Arctic Science Ministerial in Berlin, and is actively working now, and also, of course, talking about how to coordinate IPY funding. So I think we are much better set up this time than we were last time. And I'm hopeful that this will work much better now, and see that some countries like Canada already has a very strong discussion on that, and Norway has too. We are starting in Germany on discussing that. We are involved some of the projects that Henry showed. So Arctic Pulse, for example, is a German component as well, and Antarctica in Sync is something that Germany, I think, was even suggesting. So I hope that other countries will follow the example. In the US, I know that there's also a planning already started. So we have some time, so I'm hopeful that it will work better.
I think so. Nice to hear. And Henry, he pointed out that it's just in the beginning of this planning process, and some of us thought that maybe we are starting planning too early, but maybe based upon the experience, it's time. It's a perfect time. Do you agree on that?
No, I agree. I think that you can't start too early. The IPY, I mean, the last IPY was the biggest thing in the polar regions ever organized. So with thousands of people involved, so with 200 international projects, a huge endeavor. So, and of course, it's not only these 2 years, it's a much longer process, and that's what Henry also showed. There's a pre-IPY phase, and then there is the legacy phase. And I think you need some time to really plan this through and think this through, and you need also some time to prepare also for the scientific community to be ready to participate. Because you need the buy-in of the scientists, I think. And I think we are even one step further than we were at last IPY, where we also had, of course, indigenous participation, but in the last years we learned how important exactly that part is, how important exactly this, getting the communities involved in the planning already. And that is a challenge that also has something to do with funding, that these indigenous involvement or participation or co-lead of the projects, of course, requires some pre-project activities to have the dialogue.
Thank you. And your reflection really brings me to David, because you, David, you are working in the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay. I looked it up yesterday. It was very far away. So, and you are very involved in implementation and delivery of polar science and technology and knowledge mobilization and co-development with indigenous partners and right holders, with including. So it would be nice to hear your reflection on exactly how to involve indigenous people and if the funding bodies make it as a demand, for instance, some reflection on how do we do it in a good, optimal way. And also I can add that you have been a former president of IASC, and you've also been heading the Canadian International Polar Year initiative. So we'll very much hear your reflection, David, please.
Yeah, thanks. And there's a certain amount of deja vu that comes with sitting on the stage here with Volker and watching Henry. But I think it's really important that we reflect back on what we learned last time. And in fact, if I can just go back a little bit further, there was an effort in 1982, for 1982-83, for a centenary polar year, and it started too late as well. So when we say it's really early, I think that's good advice for all of us to prepare for that. One thing I'll say is that last time we talked a lot about legacies. In fact, starting in 2005, well before we initiated the Polar Year projects, or in many cases even had funding in place, we talked about scientific legacies and collaborative legacies and human legacies. And part of the reason for that is, remember, we need to sell this to funders and governments. We're competing for finite research resources with other communities that have needs as well and urgencies to understand what's happening to our planet and all of us. So, we can't take it for granted that just because we declare an International Polar Year that there will be an International Polar Year. There will be polar science. But what distinguishes a polar year from just business as usual? And it really comes down, in my mind, to the things that we've been talking about, the collaborative opportunities that will exist, the ways that as a community over the last decade or two, we've really embraced different ways of knowing, indigenous knowledges, and it goes beyond just sort of co-development. It really is recognizing that indigenous people living in the North need to lead on these initiatives and programs, and making sure that as funders we provide equitable access to funding resources. And that in Canada has been a real challenge, redefining who's an expert, what types of organizations can receive and hold funding, what's an early career researcher, So I think we've made a lot of progress on that, but there's an expectation that we incorporate that from the very beginning into our planning for IPY. One other group that I think we should really engage with, and in Canada I sit as one of the departmental science advisors with our national science advisor, and that is a network I think we can develop as a way of, or tapping into that network of where countries have national science advisors to help to build the connectiveness to other important priorities in countries. So we've talked about that a little bit here, making sure decision makers, citizens see the value in this work. But pragmatically, I think we have to distinguish, between what we do now in this ramp-up phase and what we will do during the IPY period. And that's where the science becomes really important. But in the ramp-up phase, I think we need to be investing in infrastructures. And so last IPY, it was a little bit too late, right, to put new satellites up. It was a little bit too late to build new ships. It was a little bit too late for new research stations. But we have that opportunity now to be looking ahead. What are the tools that will enable the research? And so I think there's a real opportunity to be thinking about those infrastructures as early as possible. The same for how we invest in people, in the capacity building, early career researchers, indigenous researchers, and provide the opportunities for people to get to know each other in this sort of build-up period towards the IPY. Provide development grants so that people can really, start to work together before they need to jump into a big project. And as funders, the other thing that we're starting to see is there's an opportunity for glue funding. We don't need big pots of funding, because we already have a lot of other projects that have resources and have been successful in other funding calls. And that's really what Arctic Pulse is about. There's been a couple of references to that. In Canada, we have several very large projects through large funding initiatives over sort of 5 to 7 year time periods. They were successful independently, but they're all working in the Arctic. They're all using ships, they're all using data, they're all working with communities. With just a little bit of connective tissue, we can add value to those projects. And I think we need to, look for those opportunities. That's outside of the normal funding calls and envelopes that exist in many cases, but the resources are there to allocate to provide that connective tissue. So we've got all the ingredients, we just need to make sure we make them sticky where we can. And that'll serve us well in IPY as well, I think. Recognizing that the funding is going to come from many different places. You asked about, incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge holders and peoples and communities. For Polar Knowledge Canada, it's been a priority to make sure that all of our funding calls prioritize the inclusion of Indigenous organization and knowledge holders. One of the best examples, I think, is something we co-developed with Henry and with UKRI. It's the Canada Inuit Nunavut UK program that's just sort of wrapping up after 3 years. But I think it worked really well because from the beginning we brought the National Inuit Organization into the design of that program. And so it was a UK PI, there was a Canadian PI, there was an Inuit PI. And that's an experimental way of learning how to work together, but we learned a lot, I think, Henry, and it's a model that we could develop further. So, making sure that there's equity in how funding can be accessed, making sure there's a lead time for co-development, and then also recognizing there's national pieces like infrastructures that need lots of lead time, but we can work together on those things as well, and then a little bit of new money. So I'm pretty optimistic with this ramp into IPY that we can, do a better job than last time. But we need to be thinking about the legacies as well from right now. What happens after the next IPY? I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. But just a following up question, because you said it was important to link to other initiatives. And Henry, he showed, for instance, the UN Decade Ocean Science and so on. So, and in Canada, it's a lot of different funding agencies. Is that a challenge? How are you able to mobilize to promote that they also want to collaborate to support this polar year? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so last time we didn't have a coordinating mechanism for our funding bodies, but now we have something called CRCC, the Canadian Research Coordinating Committee, which is the presidents of all of the different granting agencies, the Canada Foundation for Innovation, which is the infrastructure group, smaller, more focused funding initiatives like Genome Canada, things like that. They meet on a monthly basis. I was invited to speak to them last week. And they asked me, how can we, make sure we're successful in the next International Polar Year? So, in different countries, it's going to look different, isn't it? And some countries, like Canada, have many, many funding organizations across many different jurisdictions, and we'll have to figure out how to, get everybody working together. We haven't formed a national committee yet. In December, we had a big Arctic Change meeting in Ottawa, and we brought everybody into the room to talk about it. We've started planting seeds a couple of years ago in government, outside of government. So people are aware of it, and I think that's the most important thing, is that people are aware of it, but aware that it has a legacy and aware that it has an opportunity to do some really innovative and different things. So it'll be a challenge, but again, I haven't heard anyone say that this is a silly idea to have another polar year, right? Why would you want to do that? Because it will allow us to coalesce a lot of the plans, ideas, and initiatives that are already underway.
Thank you. Well, then I would like to turn to you, Jon, because you are chairing the Arctic Science Funders Forum, and Volker, he said that was a very good organization. It has 28 members or something, and it's a good opportunity. So please, Jon, can you please elaborate a little bit about this Funders Forum and the opportunities you can see from your perspective?
Well, yeah, thank you. I guess quite many of you are not familiar with the Arctic Science Funders Forum and what it is. So even if Volker mentioned it briefly, the origin is from 2018 at the Arctic Science Ministerial meeting and the joint statement there. And again, from the joint statement of the science ministers at their meeting in Tokyo in 2021. Christina, you mentioned 28 countries signed the joint statement. So for the time being, 28 member countries and the 6 permanent participants of the Arctic Council. And the purpose of the Arctic Science Funders Forum is to be a soft coordination body between national science funders program. We are a coordinating body. The Funders Forum, I normally call it just the Funders Forum, but otherwise it's too long name. We do not organize calls, and we do not have our own funding in the Funders Forum, but all of the 28 member countries, of course, and the National Science Program, they have the funding. And then they meet at the Funders Forum to discuss priorities and develop maybe bilateral, multilateral programs. So it's a platform for coordination between the Arctic Science Funders Forum. And I will also say that, as you hear from the name, it's Arctic science. Henry mentioned that IPY5 is an international polar year, and I get the question sometimes, what about coordination of funding for Antarctica research? The Funders Forum are mandated by the ministers to coordinate Arctic science. And Henry mentioned there's a task group in IASC of countries and funders which will work with both the Arctic and Antarctic. But the Funders Forum is Arctic research. And hopefully, when we have established it now, I hope that the Funders Forum can make a difference in international collaboration of Arctic science towards IPY5. But we can't do a better job than each of the member countries want us to do. So one thing is to have 28 countries as members and a majority of them come to our meeting, but need to come to the meetings and contribute. That is what I think is the most important. And we are starting to discuss now, could we develop a multilateral call with using the Funders Forum as a platform, and then we can, if we agree, use, for example, the Belmont Forum or Nordforsk or other existing international organizations to organize the call itself. So hopefully the Funders Forum can develop even further to play a major role in the international collaboration towards IPY5.
Thank you, Jon. That was quite interesting to reflect upon. So reactions from you, David and Walker. Maybe start with you, Walker, because you were also leading, you have led some expeditions in Russian-German collaboration also. So picking up what Jon is saying about trying to get international call, that's very exciting. But what should it be? Should it be large projects? Should we try to do that? How should what will be most interesting to be fund in together? What do you think? Large projects, expeditions, different kind of projects. First you and then David, please. A few seconds on that.
I think there are very many different levels of funding that you can talk about. I think you can even start with seed money funding. That's what IAS is doing. And if you go back and look at the history of the Mosaic expedition, the largest expedition ever, where Polarstern was sitting in the Arctic Ocean for 1 year, that started with some just seed money from IAS that enabled scientists to sit together and develop the project. And that took some time, of course. It took 2, 3, 4 years. But at some point, when Germany said, okay, we take our Polarstern, you can have it for a year, all others came on board and supported it. And it worked. So that's one model that I think is already successful. I think the European funding has been extremely important. So both in terms of infrastructure, if you take, for example, the network of stations, Interact, There was a program from the European Union on coordinating the icebreakers, ARISE, the Arctic Research Icebreakers Coordination Project. There are extremely important projects on observations. We have lots of discussions, and Michael would say something about this, on Arctic Passion, so building an observing system. Also something that dates back to the last IPY, actually. So that's another way of funding. I think for the IPY, for the last one, we sometimes had the dream that all the funders would put their money into one pool. And it would be used for projects. That's not realistic. Yeah? The funding will always be national. I think it's more important that the funding agencies, they agree on priorities or agree on certain projects. And then, like it's done, for example, in Belmont, that there's one international review. And then the funding agencies decide to fund their national contribution. And that is something I think that could be also discussed in the Arctic Science Funders Forum. So yeah, I think you have to be pretty flexible and to see what kind of funding is realistic. I think infrastructure is also an important thing that we had in our last IPY. How do we coordinate the stations, the icebreakers? How is that funded, and how is that not only funded but also coordinated? So one thing that I think also goes back to the IPY as one of the, for me at least, one of the most important legacies, and that is the early career scientist involvement. And the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, APEX, was born within the IPY. So initiated and run, and still today run by early career scientists. And some of the people that were involved as young scientists in the IPY later became, like for example, Gail is sitting here, Executive Secretary of ISC, or Jenny Baseman maybe also sitting here, Executive Secretary of SCAR. So I think that was a very important element, and so enabling young people to be part, I think, is also very important.
Thank you. And David, very short, and you should have some comments at last. You mentioned glue money, so what do you think about a diverse kind of project? Please,
I
David.
agree with everything Volker said.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly.
Yeah.
Let me just sort of make it a little more concise and perhaps memorable. Can I do that? Yeah, sure. We need icebreakers and we need kayaks, right? Yeah. We need big projects, and they're going to be resourced differently, but we need to leave room for the individual projects as well. And all funders need to sort of think about that and ensure that we don't just define big projects as being International Polar Year. It's the little things as well. Sometimes, you know, creating that opportunity for someone that doesn't need a lot of money, but just needs something. So is it glue money? Is it seed money? It needs to be scaled to what the requirement is. I think once we define what the opportunity and vision is for IPY, then as funders, we need to make sure we have resources that we can pool or have common calls or allocate for projects that'll be contributing to the IPY of whatever scale. So yeah, we'll have to see how that evolves, but the flexibility within our own funding systems, I think, exists to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, David. And John, you will have the last words in this panel now, please.
Yeah, thank you. I agree very much with both what they say about the seed money and not too big projects, and all types of funding is useful. From a funder side, we have to take into account quite many factors in how we fund different projects. We have national priorities. All of us have national priorities. We have the priorities of our decision makers we have to take into account. One thing I nearly always mention is that countries have different fiscal years. United States, October to September. Many European countries are fiscal years January to December. Canada, isn't it, April to March? That makes it a little bit more difficult for the funders to come together and for example, put money into a common call. We need to plan that quite well in advance. But if we have, seed money, smaller amount of money, I think that's much easier to do than to have a huge call where they put huge amount of money from each country into it. So there are there are quite a lot of factors we need to find our way through. But I will also say that national priorities is not contrary to international priorities in Arctic science. I think they align very, very good in nearly all of the cases. So I'm also optimistic. I hope that we can develop the international collaboration towards IPY, and that the funders can play a major role in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then thank you for this first panel. So this panel, some of them at least, was very optimistic. Now let's invite the scientists to this second panel. And first of all, I would like to invite Mikael Karker. He's a senior scientist at Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. Please take the seat. And then Jørgen Berge, you are a dean at the Faculty of Bioscience and Fisheries and Economics at the University of Tromsø. Please take the seat. And then Amy McFarlane, you are a postdoctoral researcher in the field of Arctic sea ice and snow physics at the University of Tromsø and also at Northumbria University in UK. And finally, I would like to invite Maria Helena Sivonen. She's a researcher at the Finnish Environment Institute. So please take the floor. So the first panel, they were optimistic and they were also respectful of the lessons learned from the previous International Polar Year. And they reflect about the different needs of different kind of projects, large projects, smaller projects, and so on. So I'm curious, I would like to start with you, Mikael, because you are now leading, your scientific lead of the quite huge project, the EU Arctic Passion Project. I think they had a workshop there yesterday. And the aim of that project is to improve the Arctic observing system. So, and also that you have 40 partners organizations, including the indigenous organizations. So when you listen to the previous panel and Henry Burgess here, what's your reflection and what's your experience and what will you bring forward to this panel in that respect, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina, and a warm good morning to everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect on what has been said and the overall questions. I must say I agree with the optimism, and I was really happy to hear what has been said by the funding organization representatives. I think a lot of the things which I would bring forward based on the experience we have gained in the Arctic Passion Program would be very similar, so I'm happy with that. There may be a few more additional things I would like to raise. So we heard about the importance of international funding opportunities, joint calls. So that is something I would strongly support. I think what is important here is that we do learn from flaws of existing international funding calls, like the Belmont Forum. It's not ideal, we all know that. So are there opportunities to amend those kind of flaws for these future funding opportunities? Another important part, I think, is this early onset of funding calls. We heard that in the previous panel. I think what is important here is that the time between the funding decision and the start of the International Polar Year is large enough so that the research community can adjust to the decisions made, so that not all the funding which is known about and which is secured is known a year before the action starts. We need a bit more buffer also to react. And then equity has been mentioned. This is very important. It's also at the heart of Arctic Passion. So questions like pre-funding and post-funding to keep connections and trustful relationships, develop them properly and keep them is a very important thing, and to make it possible for indigenous peoples, but also local communities to participate. And that brings me to my last point. I think there will be excellent science hopefully, and I'm optimistic, as part of IPY, but we need to make sure, given the large challenges which are there, and we heard a lot about that this morning on the big picture panels, we must make sure that it's more than just excellent science papers, which comes out of the IPY. We need to make sure that the needs of the people, of societies, are covered as well. So as scientists and research funding organizations, we should think about how can we involve people representing society in our research setups already, so that something useful is coming out also for them to tackle climate change challenges and support sustainable development in the region. So these are the points I would want to stress here.
Thank you. And then I got a bit curious, because we need to do that, but how? Do you have any experience on how, in a successful way, involve, for instance, the citizens? Have you any?
I think we do have a number of organizations which we can sit together with, like the Arctic Mayors Forum. We have been doing that in the past years to some extent. I would hope that we can extend this collaboration to directly speak with and involve, for example, municipal leaders, people from the administrations in the municipalities or regional local governance, and the same holds then for indigenous communities and indigenous people's representatives, to sit together with them to design together research programs and maybe even the funding structures. It would be important that also the funding calls already have a voice, reflect the voices of the people in the region. And I think this can be done. And a lot of positive examples have been coming up in the past years. And I think we need to follow this path to make that happen.
Thank you, Mikael. And from the start, I guess, co-design.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jürgen, you are also chairing a very large initiative on the Arctic Ocean 2050. So can you say reflect a little bit on how that will be international, and how would you work internationally?
By default, when we look at the Arctic Ocean is not possible to understand the central Arctic Ocean without looking at the international perspective. We, of course, we develop a plan based on our sort of national priorities and our sector of the Arctic. But in order for this to work and actually make a difference, it needs to be a large, coordinated international effort. So I think it goes very much hand in hand with the ambition of IPY. I hope to see, when Henry shows his slides of large initiatives, that the Arctic Ocean 2050 is also listed as one of these longitudinal. Yes, because I think that is important. Because everyone have been sort of very optimistic here, and by nature I'm also optimistic. But I think there are some challenges that we need to be aware of and take seriously. And I tend to think of them as the 3 C's. C, the letter. One is co-funding. Many have talked about funding. Co-funding is important, and we can't underestimate the importance of making sure that there are initiatives, projects that are co-funded. The second is coordination, and that's probably more important, to make sure that the national priorities and initiatives, which, because I agree with what previous speakers have said, the funding will be national. There are national priorities at the base here, but they need to be coordinated and put together into large coordinated efforts where we sort of take charge, where we have a joint effort. And then the last is climate. And with climate, I'm not just thinking about the sort of the obvious climate change that is, of course, at the basis here, but there's a political, international, geopolitical climate that both gives boundaries. It limits our ability to work coordinated, but it also at the same time increase the necessity for a coordination and cooperation. One is what you are working with, the coordination, collaboration in terms of research infrastructure. That is difficult in itself, but then also in this geopolitical climate that we have, there will also be much more in IPY5 than in the previous 4. There will be national priorities when it comes to securing data and knowledge. It's not given, it's not sort of by default that the measurements data collected by one institution or one nation is readily shared with others. There are some serious limitations and challenges when it comes to cooperation, data sharing, and coordination that we need to overcome. So the fact that we are starting now is very good, of course. Mm-hmm. But we need the time from now on.
Thank you, Jørgen. And I think you picked up some really challenging points that we also could address a little bit in the discussion afterwards. How to cope with this geopolitical situation. And somebody mentioned yesterday, I think, is it possible to have an international polar year without Russia, for instance? But we can leave it to the discussion afterwards, because now I would like also to go to you, Amy. You are representing a young career, the future. And you have also a very interesting background. And you, for instance, you were attending Mosaic for 1 year. I think that must have been really exciting to drift through the Arctic Ocean and be trapped in the ice. So I guess you had a lot of cooperation with other scientists from other parts of the world and other fields. So it would be interesting to hear your experience and what you are thinking when you hear all these other persons here about funding and so on. So what's your comment?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. So I think coming from an early career research perspective and realizing, acknowledging how important it is for international collaborations and really setting this up for not just like a personal use, but also the science that I am working on. So I'm realizing now that, or I have realized for quite a while, how important it is for my career to advance, for example, to have this international movement and mobility, but also be working on these projects that are extremely international. I come from, I would say it's a very unusual background compared to my peers, so I'm incredibly fortunate to be involved in the Mosaic expedition, where I got really, direct access to a huge international team of different scientists coming from not just international, but also really interdisciplinary. So I wasn't just working within my field, but I was also, on snow and sea ice, but also working with oceanographers, atmospheric scientists. And that gave me a huge opportunity to kind of look into my future and see, yes, which topic would I also like to go down and study. So it gave me that opportunity, which was absolutely fantastic. And I think having this focus on early career research is, for our own benefit, we want to travel internationally and our careers advance using this kind of great tool. So I think having funding that allows this to happen is so critical. And one of the things that I really found useful after the Mosaic expedition was the follow-up of conferences. So there were three Mosaic conferences after we returned, and it really allowed scientists to group together. And I think David was talking about this like connecting tissue and like getting to know each other. And I found that actually to be even more valuable than the expedition itself. It almost allowed me to, do the expedition, which was quite stressful at times, and then take a step back, look into the science, and then in these workshops afterwards, think, okay, yeah, this is the direction, these are the people I want to collaborate with. So it's also these follow-up activities after these big events, which are really, really critical. I was kind of thinking about how for example, how I'm interested in getting into, planning for IPY and planning future activities. And I kind of split it up into two different ways that I've found have helped me. So one of them is really through my peers and who I've been working with have really facilitated me getting involved in these topics. So, for example, my supervisor was really encouraging me to get involved in the IASC Cryosphere Working Group, and that gave me access to a really large group of people working to try and, to try and work towards the IPY. And then the other side is it's really like self-motivation. And I found that I had, and I see it around me, like lots of early career researchers have this self-motivation to want to contribute to these big decisions and, looking towards the IPY. And for me, APEX has stood so at the front of this. And when I've had the motivation, APEX has been there to facilitate the framework for me to step into. It started quite small, so I was leading the national committee in Switzerland, and then that allowed me to look internationally, and now I'm leading a project group within the APEX framework. So that's, I think, bringing APEX into these decision makings and giving them a platform and allowing early career researchers to really see how APEX can be making a difference really is quite, it really encourages you to get involved. So it's you see other people within this community and you think, okay, I see how my path could be on that trajectory as well. And I think touching on what Volker was saying, how this is a really long process. So this often, unfortunately, this clashes with short-term funding that early career researchers are getting. So how can we set up the frameworks for early career researchers to very quickly, I think, very quickly jump into these larger frameworks, which, get a little snapshot, understand how, so for example, an example I can think about is the IASC working groups have these early career researchers joining these discussions. And I think that I see that to be very, very valuable. So I think more involvement in kind of short-term workshops or short-term involvement of early career researchers. And then I just to finish up, I want to touch on this, the idea that was mentioned in the previous panel, this kind of is bigger, better. So who was talking? So yes, it was David talking about, we need icebreakers, but we also need kayaks. And I think, we're looking at this really international, Arctic Ocean, Arctic Poles, InSync, they're all very, very big international projects. And for trust to be given, so I found in my experience on the Mosaic expedition, I got a lot of trust given to me. And I think this was only possible because of all the training that I had access to. So I had access to a lot of training going up to the expedition, which meant that I could lead, for example, the snow measurements during the expedition. And this is a really long process. It's not a quick thing to get involved with. So I think having, the training going up is absolutely critical. Often these bigger expeditions, they are sometimes challenging for underrepresented groups to get involved with, like, for example, early career researchers, indigenous communities. So I think the NRC, the Norwegian Research Council, does this really well when there's like a funding that's going forward. There's also a early career researcher kind of sub-funding, is that how I would phrase that? And I think that is it's a really good thing to have early career researchers leading these quite large funding opportunities. So yeah, with these bigger science, we also get this, I think it's important to mention, like the larger environmental impact comes with these. And David was talking about in the previous panel discussion how we do have these limited resources. So I think it's really, really interesting going forward now, being at this critical moment that we can influence what is happening in the future. And I think there's quite a large push in the early career researchers community that I'm seeing is for better documentation of our impact. So, and I really think this is so critical at the funding stage of these big projects because of Arctic geopolitics, we're not going to have this international ability to control the impact of expeditions. So it really falls on the head of national funding bodies to, when they're receiving applications, assess, are they considering reducing their impact in this funding that they're applying for? So yeah, this leads on to this national push of nationally led initiatives, which I think is a very important part of this picture. Yeah, and I think just finishing off by saying I really see early career researchers wanting to get involved with the IPY process. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this can be made, this can happen.
I think that was a very important recommendation, and I'm quite sure that based upon what you are approaching and your aspects, I'm quite sure that it's inspiring for including early career researchers at the beginning and to also listen. You were stating that your voice is very important in different processes, and I think that has to be taken into account. So, but then I will start also give the floor to our last panelist, Maria-Helena Sivonen. You are the only social scientist here in this panel, in the two panels. And you are also an early career scientist. So, and you have been studying something very interesting. How will policy scientists, how can the authority of science in policymaking, can you reflect a little bit on that? What's your lessons learned?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. It's wonderful to be in this panel, yeah, we all know that authority of science is wavering, and perhaps the results that come from scientific research isn't necessarily heard or not wanted to be taken into consideration in policymaking, not only in Finland but in other countries as well. So I come from Finland, and my research regarding this issue is mainly from that perspective. And actually, this is one of the points that I was thinking throughout this first and this panel discussion as well, that maybe it is indeed because I am a social scientist, so my biggest thought at the moment is that it would be really helpful if these funding organizations would also highlight that what happens after the research is done, so that there would be perhaps emphasis already in the planning phase that we need to somehow implement these findings. We need to do, it's a lot of work. Science communication is not easy, and there's a reason why professionals do that, communication overall. And on top of being a best in your own field as a researcher, you also need to be able to communicate what you do, which is a lot of pressure. And for this, I think funding organizations could perhaps help as well by giving the opportunity to actually maybe hire these. And of course, this is already done in many of the big projects. But I also wanted to touch upon that issue regarding the small and big boats that we need for science in general, and I think it was Volker who said that the funding is always national. And these national differences, even in our Nordic countries, are quite significant in a sense. And just to bring in a very concrete example, that I'm about to defend my thesis in a month, And I just wrote the acknowledgements part for the thesis of thanking everyone who's been involved, because this has really needed a village, but also a tiny village or the street in the village for the funders. So there's a whole paragraph thanking my funders for this. And I've been lucky because most of my research has been funded by the Research Council of Finland, but everything else that I've been doing, wanting to travel, doing research visits in different countries, everything else is funded by other organizations. So it was a really good point about what kind of funding is realistic, but also what kind of funding is really needed, because sometimes you might need different, quite flexible funding opportunities. And this was also something that was discussed in the first already regarding the early preparedness, that it's really important, of course, but in these really changing times, is that enough? Are the funding organizations flexible enough to react to certain changes, unseen events that actually would need to be studied? And of course, this is maybe leaning towards social sciences in that sense, but once again, my work, for instance, as a researcher who studies climate change mitigation, I, of course, stand on the research that has been made in natural sciences fields. So we know that climate change is real and what happens there, but I'm interested at why we are still not doing enough politically, as a society, globally, and so on. And this brings perhaps my final point for this, that I think that it would be time for us as research community as well to move on from not making these two distinct or two straight lines between natural sciences and social sciences, because they really need each other in so many ways. It's not helpful for us to keep them in silos in any ways. Universities have obviously reacted to this in many ways. There are master's programs, for instance, that are not designated to either of these big fields, but they combine and create these new experts that have possibilities to then craft their careers towards whatever they see most helpful for them, just like you were saying that you had these chances when you were actually already in the field, which is really great, and your experience sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maria. What's your impression when it comes to the Arctic science, and how much is social science aspects reflected in the Arctic science, do you think, if you...
Well, of course, I can't speak for everyone, and highlighting that I am an early career researcher, but I am also in a very privileged position to be able to continue my work. So this work continuation and the connections that I've made during my PhD, I'm able to continue with that, which is really, really important, this continuation of a career in that sense. But what I've done is that I've been able to sneak in the Arctic in the proposals. So it's not necessarily an Arctic-specific funding, it's not Arctic-specific proposal that we have in these bigger funding bodies, but the Arctic is there. And I get to do that. I get to study more about the Arctic because it was written into the proposal and a kind of not in an open way, but it's sneaking it in many ways.
Thank you.
And I think this is really important as well to understand that even though it's not an Arctic-specific funding, it's really, these are the small paths that lead to the bigger ocean in that sense.
Thank you. And then I would like to challenge Mikael and Jørgen based upon the reflections from Maria and Amy here. Because Maria, you say you're sneaking in social sciences, and you are talking very enthusiastic and very important about including young career early and in different projects. So I would like both of you guys to respond. Have you sufficient with social science, and what about the early career? The same questions goes to you afterwards, Jørgen.
Yeah, thank you. As an old guy, I think both aspects are really important. I fully agree with what you have been saying. We have been trying to do that as good as possible in Arctic Passion. Apex is a partner in our project. We have a combination of social sciences and humanities together with natural sciences, and we realize how fruitful this is and how necessary this is if we really want to make our work useful for society. We cannot just create data, and data are never innocent, so they always have a context, they have a background, they have a reason for funding also, so we need to consider all this. So I'm very much in favor of continuing this path also into IPY, to have a strong involvement of early career scientists, and I congratulate you to having this mixed panel here with different age classes. And the same holds for social sciences and natural sciences combination. We really need all hands on deck, so to say, because the challenges are gigantic. We heard a lot about that in the last days.
And Jürgen, short from you, your response.
Yeah, there's two questions in there, one about age and one about sort of history and indigenous peoples.
Social science.
So, social science, sorry. When it comes to involving early career scientists, I can only say that it was very important for us here in Tromsø to make sure that Apex came to Tromsø, because we see that as important. And it's important for us to include early career scientists. When you look at the scientific career, it's not that many years that you are really up and running and produce the best science. It takes a long time to develop and train scientists. So we need to integrate and make sure that the early career scientists are fully integrated. When it comes to social science, I think it's by nature, by default, when we, at least when I'm talking about the Central Arctic Ocean and the program that we are developing, social science and human use is for sure a key element to that. It's a new ocean that opens up. We can't foresee now how that will play out. We know that there will be more human presence, shipping, resource extraction, tourism, and also presence of researchers. So the need to involve social science, including international law and geopolitics, is essential.
Thank you. Then I think it's time to open the floor for you audience, and you can ask questions, of course, to the panelists here, but also to the former panel. So please, and you please raise your hand and see who you are. And then I will start with Eva. Please, Eva, you present yourself and then ask the question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Eva Follet, and I'm Executive Director in the Research Council of Norway, among others, responsible for polar and marine research. Anyway, I have some reflections, no answers, but some reflection listening to you and actually the whole 2 days before this day. And it seems something we are agree about and something which can reflect more about. The first is early career. It seems to me that everybody agree that's a great idea, and I really agree with that, of course. I think everybody agree about that. The second is open up. It seems for me that the polar research, and I think about both different regions, south and north, open a little bit up, including also not only local societies, but what about business? This brings me to the next questions, fundraising. We talk about governmental funding, which is of course very important. It might be that untraditional government sources could also be funding polar research. But it also could be, is there some private funding out there? NGOs? Business. I think we should try to reflect and investigate if that is a possibility for increasing the funding of research in the polar areas. And the polar areas are different, of course, in different regions. And we talk about blue, we talk about white, and Belmont is already mentioned. It could be a great idea to use this established platform for announcing research. We have great experience with Belmont Forum in the Research Council in Norway, so that could be something. I also see that polar research is opening up in terms of what kind of research approaches you have. You come with your social science perspective, which is good. And I think also the discussion we have here about local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, etc., also give a direction to open up the scope in polar research. And Henry, I look forward to have discussion with you about how to organize the international part. As you know, we are on good timing here in Norway, but I do really look forward to talk with you about how to organize the international part of this polar year. Anyway, next generation, open up, work together, and find new sources for funding. That is my main issues.
Thank you very much.
I agree about that.
Yeah. Then I will give questions so that you will respond afterwards, because I think it's important that the audience also respond. Well, there was one here and there and there. Maybe you should start with on the front here. So please, and present yourself.
Yes, thanks a lot. Matthias Albert from the University of Bielefeld. Tons of comments and questions. I'll limit myself to one. After having listened to quite a number of presentations on the International Polar Year over the last year or so, I have a question that is very basic, probably bordering on the naive, but I still want to ask it. We've heard about all the difficulties when it comes to somehow move from international collaboration to some kind of internationalization of funding. And I think there's a very nascent seed there in what Jan Vogelstad presented. We've heard about the lead times, the long lead times, and the efforts involved in planning for an international polar year. So, and let me say, I do not think that an international polar year is a silly thing, quite to the contrary. But the very basic question being, given the amount of changes we are facing, the speed of changes we are facing, the volatility in the funding landscape. I mean, we just saw this week, oh, the US funding might be cut off one day to the next. Given all this situation, why not think about being even more ambitious? Why save for legacy reasons an international polar year and not, to use the Latin term, an international polar lustrum, an international polar 5 years? I dare not say a 5-year plan, but why not more than a year?
Thank you. I will not let you respond just now, because I will give the floor to the...
Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Anne. I'm based at the British Embassy in Copenhagen, working with Henry under his British hat. A question around... We've heard a lot about the different types of funding, supporting policy link-up, supporting indigenous engagement. All of that sounds really positive, that there's so much consideration both from funders and researchers. My own background is in biomedical science, and there has been a massive drive towards acknowledging this sort of moving away from only crediting Nature papers when you look at career progression and you look at sort of next stages of your career, where there's been massive work at a lot of universities to try and factor in innovation initiatives or translational clinical research or whatever it might be. To what extent is this happening in Arctic science on polar research? Do you feel that researchers are adequately acknowledged for the work they do in policy link-up or in indigenous engagement or whatever it might be? And if not, is that conversation happening between funders and universities and so on?
Okay, thank you. One more question and then prepare for respond. Take the other one there, one of them.
Yes, thank you so much for the very interesting talks. My name is Annemijn Sandig. I work for Wageningen Marine Research. I'm an early career researcher. So my question is about the equity when involving early career researchers. I'm trying to navigate the scientific landscape myself, and I feel that I have needed a lot of support from senior colleagues or previous thesis supervisors. So for me, it's a very important topic of how early career researchers which have not had that same opportunity to be included and their voices being heard.
Thank you.
And if you have any suggestions for that.
I think then we'll stop there and try to respond. The first one about more ambitious. Who would like to respond? Henry, would you like to respond on that? More ambitious, not only 2 polar years, 2 years, but maybe 5, maybe a decade.
Yes, that's very much in our minds, absolutely. So direct you to the timeline here. So the polar year will be 32 and 33, but that is a peak of activity, not very much the only activity. So we're envisaging that people can start IPY projects in 26 maybe, or 27, 28, kind of continue a peak of activity and reporting and kind of focus and energy in 32, 33, and then they can carry on beyond that as well. We didn't want to start with the idea of a decade because it's just daunting. It's impossible for funders and others to make decades work. I think, to be honest, we're seeing that a little bit with the UN Ocean decade. Not all countries are able just to get their heads around the fact that it's a decade. So we wanted to build on the success of the previous IPYs, which have been focused around a couple of years, use that as a jumping off point, but say to people, you don't have to just do your work in those 2 years. It can be before, during, and afterwards as well.
Thank you very much. Then also another question about the scientists, Arctic scientists, are they sufficiently adequately acknowledged? And somebody would like to respond? Yeah.
Do you mean integration with social science? Wasn't that the question?
The question number 2.
Yeah.
So around whether career progression takes into account all the sort of surrounding activities, not just the production of papers, for instance.
I think there are some challenges there when it comes. Now I'm going to speak only from Norway and from our perspective. The number of sort of challenges or demands is a better word that first of all a PhD student is supposed to tackle is increasing, and I think there is a need to look more into how we educate and train early career scientists, because the world is changing and the demands are more diverse, and it's more difficult to overcome them. So I guess the answer is no.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the risk being that if we don't adequately acknowledge all the different surrounding activities, you might end up promoting or advancing careers of the people who sit back and publish good papers, but they do not have those practices.
I think it's important to see the training of researchers, including both the PhD and the postdoc level. Many of the PhDs that we educate, they will not go into science. Okay. But there's a recruitment element for training researchers that is embedded into the postdoc tool.
And Amy, maybe you also will respond on this, and also the third question about the equity and so on. Yeah, first Amy, and then Maria, and then I think we must wrap up.
Yeah, no, I can just add on to the second question.
Yeah.
You know, speaking from my own personal experience, I feel like I do have a lot of side projects with my work. And what I found is that it was, you know, I'm so appreciative for my PhD supervisor to facilitate that and to acknowledge that that is an important part of my scientific career. And I certainly wouldn't be sitting up on this panel if I didn't do those extra activities. So I think it's extremely important to have that additional side just to the pure science that you're doing. And I actually found, you know, I've only gone through one recruitment process, but I found that the people who are looking to hire me maybe are specifically focused on like also the extracurricular activities that I'm doing. And I want to work with those people who are acknowledging that, right? So it's kind of like a two-way thing. So if in an interview process they aren't interested in any of the additional things and it's purely about the papers that I'm writing, It's a little bit of a red flag for me, because I'm so interested in these things that come along with science that I would want, this kind of relationship with a supervisor or future collaborations. So, I think, yeah.
Okay. And Maria?
I also want to say thank you for the question that you posed regarding this issue. And it is certainly a jungle that needs to be navigated, and it changes in different countries and in different universities. And it's really another aspect to early career researchers that you necessarily don't think when you enter your PhD time. But I also want to thank for this comment that you made about these extracurricular activities. But indeed, I echo you that it is those supervisors and those mentors that put their time and effort to help us, because that's why that's why we are able to do what we really want, in a sense, because that's also an extra job, extra thing for those supervisors who want to do it well and who see that this is something that I want to help with. And that's really important. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I will take from my training period of 5 years to become a doctor, and I will try and take it further as well, because that's really important.
Well, thank you very much. Then I'm sorry, we have to wrap up. And there are still some interesting questions, and I would encourage you to raise those to the different persons in the break. But just the absolutely final part, I will give you just 3 words, each of 4 of you, the most important words to bring as advice to the Arctic, the funders of Arctic Science. And we'll start with you, Maria. What would that be?
Science policy interface.
Thank you. Amy?
That's a good question. Like assessments, optimism, and inclusivity.
Lovely. And Jørgen?
Coordination would be my first word. And the 3 C's.
Yeah. Let's make science in the IPY useful for many people.
Thank you very much. Useful for many people. There are some challenges we're certainly also facing, but I think we will end this session by being optimistic, and it is in due time to start the planning. So by that words, I really thank you for attending this side event, and I hope you have a nice weekend and still fruitful discussions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.